we want to spend the bulk of the time in small groups discussing some of the challenges you guys are all having, delivering simulation online or education online in various formats. The key thing to really get the message across is the definition. The definition is that it's a sense of feeling, it's a perception, right? That individuals or even team members can feel that they feel safe enough for risk-taking behavior. And that risk-taking behavior normally involves things like asking risky questions, speaking up, raising your hand, disagreeing with people, asking for feedback. But you have this safe feeling that you can do all of these things, knowing that you're not going to be told off, knowing that it's not going to have negative consequences. You're not going to be shouted down in front of the rest of the team on the ward round. It's not going to affect your end of placement grading if you are questioning the consultant about their management, for example. So that's what psychological safety is. And then why is it important? What happens when we see it? And Amy Edmondson would have spoken about a lot of this, but when people do start speaking up, you see a shift in behavior. So often there better communications, there's better collaboration between team members. The research show that actually team working between different professions also improves increased team satisfaction. A lot of this research has come from the business world, so organizational learning, a lot of psychometric type studies looking at these outcomes. From the educational context, there hasn't been as much research looking into empirical research looking at psychological safety and the effects on education. But what we do know from the rest of the literature is that it enables creative work, new ways to act, behave, try out new things, to be creative, to engage in conversations with others, even to engineer task conflict where you're disagreeing within small groups. That's a form of creativity as well. And so very quickly you can see why psychological safety is important. Yes, in the clinical world, but also in education, and even more so in online education, especially because it's a different world that we're living in when we're thinking about pedagogy through IT, computer, virtual worlds. A lot of the issues around or the barriers that exist to creating psychological safety in classrooms or in healthcare on the ward or in clinics, those barriers are still there, and if anything, they're exemplified in the virtual world. So you will still have hierarchy, and you can see that in the talk that's going on right now. So the people who have dominated the floor in talking are the people who are named as the speakers, who is the chair. There's a direct imbalance of speaking rights, and that's we need to think about that. How do we abolish that? The other challenge, we noticed again, Lucy was saying, Sharon, we've never met, and that's because there's 50, 60, 70 odd people. Now, if we were in a class, I suspect Lucy would have had, as Lida was saying, Lucy would have had a chance to go up to Sharon and say, hey, hi Sharon, I've never met you before. And what happens by doing those small things, we start getting to know each other on a personal level. We see where our mutual interests are, and whether we share commonalities, and that's where we start building relationships and feeling part of a group. So you start getting group coherence, and we start getting a sense of identity. So we already, of those people who have spoken, we already start to get a sense of those identities. But then what happens when we don't talk? So a good 80% of the people haven't spoken. So what have we got to go on? We're going on what people look like, their names. Potentially, we may have a list of different professions. And then what happens, we rely upon constructed stereotypes. So I'm a pediatrician, so you may get a stereotype of me, and we've got lots of people from SLAM, so you may have stereotypes of them. How do we go beyond those? Luckily, a lot of us know each other, so we're not relying on those stereotypes. But that can also inhibit interaction, engagement, trust formation. And then another layer of complexity on top of all of that is the IT world, the virtual world, navigating Zoom, your camera, your microphone, slide sharing, all of these things. These build in anxiety, cognitive load, and can really impact your engagement. I put in geographically dispersed. That's what we are in the virtual world, and in research has shown that teams which are spread out have less contact, and there is a degree of less, a sense of feeling less psychologically safe. So one of the things that we can do is try to reduce those reduce that distance in a sense. And the way I like to think about that is making contact early. So getting information out by email, using things like online discussion forums. What we also still need to recognise is that there still is going to be pre-existing relationships in the room, and there is right now pre-existing relationships. So I suspect there's, you know, probably 4 or 5 people in the room right now who are very comfortable at probably interrupting me, knowing that I'm completely fine with that. And that's because that relationship's there. But we need to recognise that in our learners, because our learners, especially in this room of 50 or 60, I suspect there's probably groups of 2, 3, 4 people who know each other, and they will feel safe in their own groups. So that's something we need to know about and be aware of. And the last thing about where I've said more loosely defined goals in education, certainly in the world I work in, there's a lot of free-flowing discussion. There's not necessarily right or wrong answers. It's all about perspectives, and that's how we learn. There's models of learning in that sense. And so we want people, you know, often the group works that we set or the conversations that we engage in can be or can seem quite nebulous. And research has shown that we need more psychological safety in those areas for us to feel safe enough to be creative, to speak out loud, rather than in those tasks which are very narrow. So think of a surgical setting and a WHO checklist, for example, which is, you know, very black and white in terms of the steps. And if a step's missed out, someone may be able to feel more empowered to say this step's missed out, although you still need a degree of psychological safety there as well. And what all of this means is, as in the real world in a sense, and also in the virtual world, is that trust is very slow to form amongst us. And that's a really key thing in psychological safety and engagement. And it's often more fragile. It can take a long time to build up this trust, and sometimes saying something wrong can just, it can feel like you're just destroying that straight away. So those are some of the challenges of the virtual world. And they're not comprehensive. This is more of a conceptual level. And what we would want when we break into groups now, essentially, is for you to think about some of the challenges you guys are facing in your online worlds, in whether it's simulation or other types of education you're delivering.
To me, one key thing that's quite transversal and probably a good way in is that question of very practical communication. So how people do relate to each other online. And there is a technical side to it, which is about, you know, people accessing the platforms, their sort of skills using the technology. But there's something which is more about the styles of facilitators. So how do you need to rewrite the way you utilize nonverbal cues, how you address people, how you have to heavily rely on more signaled nonverbal stuff. And also something we've discussed in our group quite a lot, which is paradoxically the fact we are all small heads on the same level, but if there are preconceptions and assumptions about, you know, status and stuff which are barriers to speaking up, how do you break them? And this quite strange effect of being in a way much more exposed, despite this sort of dilution of everyone online and everyone being muted. But as soon as you start speaking, you have to raise your hands as a child before. You have to unmute yourself. Sometimes the system puts you under the spotlight with a square, or, you know, lights you up, and that's a real barrier, I think, for many, or at least changes the dynamic for a fluid engagement for a group. So just a few thoughts, but on that sort of transversal theme of what's the communication skills and styles and barriers, which I think is really central.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Craig. Just picking up a theme from here, which maybe I'll ask from the floor if anyone wants to elaborate on what that question is. There's lots of comments here about nonverbals and the loss of nonverbals. Does anyone want to share the impact of that has been and any strategies they've used?
So just from the group I was in, I'm going to keep talking since you've given me the mic. I can't stop now. I think that one of the comments was that it's inhuman. There's something really unpleasant and genuinely disconcerting about this state of play. So it's not just that it's a lack of communication, it's uncomfortable and awkward. And also we've briefly touched on the cognitive load and distractibility online, which is yet another area I think that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the difficulty with feeling detached and not connected to your participants and the people you're teaching. That was something we really talked about quite a lot in our group. Just not really knowing what's happening for them. Are they listening? Are they engaged? Do they have another window open when they're supposed to be attending teaching? And just lots about the kind of almost the way our imagination runs away with ourselves as facilitators and educators about how much our students are actually participating in the learning and how difficult it is to gauge that.
Anita, were you saying that there's a distraction as an educator thinking, are they listening?
Yes. So we were talking about how we'd normally just be fully focused when we're in the room, but when you're teaching online, there's always a part of your mind that is thinking, are they really listening? Are they really engaged? You know, especially I think we had Emily who was talking about, she has to do lots of her teaching on Teams to nursing students who are quite novice learners. She can have up to 300 people in her sessions online. And so there's really very little room to interact in any real way with those students. And then you're just constantly worrying about whether or not they're even listening and you know, what's actually happening for them during that learning experience.
I think that's really, really interesting, Lucy. We had the same in ours, but within ours, there's also a couple of comments about actually it is more tiring engaging in this way. And so sometimes people do just need to stand up and walk around a room, or you can take your laptop to go and make a coffee, which means you might turn your camera off, but you're still listening. You're just using the time differently. And I think there's a certain maybe understanding of if you say it's possible to use your time differently, but still engage in learning because of the different medium, if that makes sense.
Isabel, you had your hand up.
So this isn't something we discussed in the group, but I have a very good friend who has Asperger's, and she says with some amusement that the challenges that neurotypical people have on Zoom are the challenges that she experiences in her normal life. So coming back to the point about it being exhausting, what she reminded me is that the nonverbal cues that we take for granted and allow us in quite a relaxed way to have conversations are the very nonverbal cues that she doesn't have. So she's watching the neurotypical world, engaging with Zoom and feeling fatigued and feeling stressed because the whole part of their communication system is now closed to them. And I thought that was really insightful and quite fascinating.
Yes, that's interesting because I've run a course recently whereby the previous study day, the students were all asking, could they turn their cameras off? And then, yeah, they asked me, I can see people shaking their heads. And then they asked me, can we turn our cameras off? And I said, well, really, it's quite hard for me to know that you're engaging. If you're talking to me, then please put your camera on, but you're all adult learners. You know, they wanted to be treated with some kind of respect and what have you. But yeah, and then interestingly, a colleague found out that I'd let them turn their cameras off, and they were kind of tutting and really shaking their head that that was a terrible thing to do. I did notice half the group kept their cameras on for the majority of the day, but some people never turn their cameras on once, and that is really disconcerting. I don't know what anyone feels about that. How do people feel about it?
Can I say something? Because we've had a lot of discussion about this. And I said it in our group, there is a bit of a gender issue here about cameras on, especially with I teach undergraduates. They're young, they always are camera ready, and sometimes they're not camera ready and they don't want their camera on. I have students who wear wigs, and if they haven't got their wig on, they're not ready, they prefer to turn their camera off. And we can't assume just because they've got their camera off that they're not listening to us. That we've got to think about some of the other reasons. However, what I was saying was, when I've got my slides up and I can't see anyone and I can't hear, I have no idea what the interaction's like, if they're still there or if they have gone away. So that's why it was really, really difficult.
Greg, we'll come to you just in a moment, but I think I'm kind of hungry for strategies as well. Just thinking, when the non-verbal's gone, either because the camera's gone or just because this is what you're getting. What have you done?
Please, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So non-verbal is critical, not only for us to read the group, but vice versa. We convey meaning and learning through non-verbal as faculty. So that's something. So we're losing something out of our toolbox as teachers. So I want just to emphasize that as well. The strategies I use is, at the moment, I've got 25 of you on a screen. The largest groups I normally do is 20. So how can you monitor that whilst also trying to maybe go through slides, etc.? So the way I do it, and not everyone's going to be able to do this, so I tend to work on two screens. One screen, I have everyone's faces open on one screen, and slides and stuff we're working on another. And that's one way which I try to do it. I do try to say to everyone, keep cameras turned on, and I have had a session where with an external speaker, the rest of the students in the group were slowly one by one turning their cameras off, and I could feel the impact, and I imagine how that's going to feel for the guest speaker. So I individually, privately messaged and just asked them, are you having IT issues? And very quickly everyone turned their cameras on. I think it's too early for us to know about what turning cameras on and off means from a research perspective, but I think we're just going to learn as we go through time.
Catherine, I mean, you spoke about a tricky situation with the students, a learner.
Yeah. It was in the context of an action learning set, which is quite experimental virtually. And there was a point where I thought a student may be starting to feel emotional, and I thought that I saw flickers facially, but didn't feel very confident about it. And we talked a little bit, Lucy, about it. It kind of knocked my confidence as a facilitator, of that moment of panic of kind of, where do I go with this in terms of how you support the situation, move forward, etc. And I did then openly question and say, it's very difficult to read on the screen, emotions and how people are feeling. I wonder how, at this point, what you're telling us is affecting you, type of thing. So I did address it, but I did have that kind of moment of fear and panic of where to go next with it. And I think that it did feel very, very limiting. I felt very limited by it.
I think it's, I do think it's acceptable for people to switch their cameras off at times, but also I think quite often we might just ask people, can you switch your camera on when we're discussing things, so that they're active in the conversation. But then I think during simulations, there's so many periods in the day where you can have your camera off. During debriefs, you do need your camera on, but I think it's important to allow people to have a space to have their camera off and to relax a bit, because sometimes I think looking at your own image becomes a distraction. But I think being very specific in the kind of ground rules part of the day about there's times when we're going to need you to have your camera on, and we really need to make sure that that's going to be able to happen, and kind of anticipate it before it becomes an issue, feels a bit easier at times. I think it just feels a bit more of an agreement with the learners, rather than you must have your camera on, which will impact on the psychological safety as well.
In our group, on that question of cognitive load, there was a few things around. One, how less engaging are online interactions, so you don't have the sort of energy and motivation to keep going, and it's much easier to get distracted. And people in the chat were mentioning, home situation, whatever is going on around. but also, you know, the well-known distractibility on screen, where you have notifications and other things going on. There's multi-layers of potential cognitive load happening there.
In our group, we talked about recording and how that could be something that felt quite inhibiting and maybe make you feel a bit less free with your communication if you know that your session is being recorded, and a bit less control over your material. And maybe, as Ranjev mentioned earlier about joking and being funny, and how maybe that you feel a bit more limited to do that because out of context it might not fall right, or that might not work so well.
You don't get much response from the other end, and you just feel a bit vulnerable that you are in front of 30, 40 people and you're exposed.
Mm. Yeah, that resonates. I can see lots of nods of the head. I think it feels lonely or isolating. You know, I'm in my room. What happens if this goes wrong? Raj will fix it, but you know, or Maddie.
I think most people probably heard the introductions. We are from Muzzy Simulation. We do high fidelity mental health simulation. We do lots of it. I started working in February as a fellow. I'm by no way an expert in simulation by any stretch, but we've lots of expertise within our faculty. What we've tried to do, maybe this conversation, I'll bring Anita in as well, is just collating our collective reflections on the challenges of working online, in the hope that be able to generalize this to other educator groups, and they can maybe benefit from it also. So obviously, just, you know, preaching to the choir here, but debriefing is the heart and soul of simulation, and it's good quality debriefing is dependent on the facilitator's skills and also the learner's perceptions of a psychologically safe and supportive learning environment. And if it's done badly, it can lead to adverse learning, negative feelings in participants, and diminished clinical performance, and potentially harm to the learner-educator relationship. And debriefing, before we ever thought about doing it online, is demanding, and I think facilitators experience a high cognitive load, and the higher the cognitive load, that can in turn impact on how they perform and how the learners, what the learners get from the day. So within our simulation practice, we use primarily, and for the most part, simulated patients as actors, and a communication process focused debrief. And I suppose, given that, we maybe feel that we're well placed to figure out some of the obstacles in that way that come from digital migration. So as I said, over the summer we built this really from the ground up and didn't really know what it would look like until we had it done. And along the way we tried to gather, as we went, faculty's observations and reflections, and I tried to put a bit of structure on that and categorize them thematically in kind of synthesizing our experience. So initially, the prospect of working online meant that we wouldn't have usual informal introductions, chats between participants and facilitators before we started. That was a big loss. I think there was a lot of skepticism about how we could actually achieve psychological safety without that. And also, before we ever got started, I think we'd had a few months of Zoom gloom and video conferencing fatigue, so we knew there was a bit of a ceiling on that. So what I'll try to do, and I'll bring Anita in a second, is go through some of the key headings that emerged, and talk about our experiences, and then some of the little strategies that we came up with. So the first one really was a higher cognitive load, and that's been mentioned. Anita, would you like to mention just a little bit about your initial impression about the cognitive load and how it differs from in-person sim?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I'm really taken with the person who mentioned their neurodiverse friend, because I think that really is, it just initially felt really, really challenging that we just no longer could. I think all these things that we probably do on a really unconscious way day to day, where we're reading body language, checking the engagement of participants, we could just no longer do that online. So I became much more conscious of trying to kind of gauge people's responses from the shoulders up, much more aware of my own use of my, like, just nodding and shaking head and being much more mobile in that part of the screen, just to try to compensate or overcompensate, which in itself does become quite tiring and exhausting. And again, that bit of your mind that's always thinking about, well, what else is going on or what could go wrong, and worrying about the technical aspects all the time as well, where you just don't feel like you can be fully in the moment. But I think, you know, I think initially that felt really overwhelming, really draining. But I think over time, the more that we've done this, I think initially we thought, oh, we'll never be able to do more than a half day of simulation training. But we're now doing full days with, you know, 4 or 5 scenarios with actors. We've had multiple participants in the scenarios. So, and we've started to have much more complex scenarios as well, and fully engage people in the debriefs. I think the learners have gone away really satisfied with what they're getting from it. So yeah, I think initially that cognitive load, it's almost that you have to practice it. It's like riding a bike or something, and just learning to, it's like any new skill, I think.
And that was it, yeah. So when we started out, we did half-day sessions. We found it quite tiring. As Anita said, there was lots in the mix. You know, we were attending to the verbal and non-verbal cues, but they were all slightly distorted, and it wasn't quite the real thing. And it was a new way of engaging. We were worried about internet connections. We also had to monitor loads of different communication streams, WhatsApp chats. How's your signal? How's your video? All that sort of stuff. For me, I experienced a lot of eye strain, and I also found, you know, overdoing it over a day, it could be quite tiring sitting in the same place and not being able to stand up and walk around a classroom as you would. So some of the things that we found have mitigated some of the cognitive load was just increased confidence, and we did a lot of practicing, really. You know, we spent a lot of time on the platform. We troubleshooted, we clicked every button. We tried to incorporate regular breaks, and we also tried to make distinct the role of the facilitator and the role of the moderator, and I'll say a bit more about that. You know, so in summary, with more practice, we became more confident, and the cognitive load did come down a bit as well. And we also hope that, you know, participants, we were fortunate because, you know, the world en masse suddenly had to learn video conferencing, and we benefited from that. I think it would have been a lot more difficult if we'd done it in peace times, so to speak, when people didn't really use video conferencing. Nobody would have known what we were doing. The next thing that came up as a recurring theme was what I've called anyway, the live TV effect. So this is a feeling, and I think people have mentioned it, of a higher cognitive load coupled with a feeling of intense focus on you. And it was described as being a big departure from in-person sessions, where you could pop out to the loo, you could make a coffee, you could check your phone, and it didn't feel like the clock was ticking. And there's a few factors that came up with that, about participants not being able to communicate casually with one another. And as a result, you need to actively chair things and manage things. And then you also have to, as we said, keep an eye on lots of different chat streams and monitor your own video, monitor your own audio, second guess yourself if people aren't responding to what you're saying. Sometimes you froze. There was lots of things that made it feel to me, not that I've been on live TV, but like what live TV probably feels like. Anita, did you have anything to say just on that feeling? And did you?
Yeah, it's like having the producer in your ear, isn't it? You know, trying to, because you're kind of monitoring a chat, and then you might have messages coming through from our tech and from our admin, because we've got people coming late, but you're still trying to do your teaching bit as well. So your kind of focus is over 3 or 4 areas, whereas before, if you were getting messaged by someone being late, you might have left the room briefly to get that message and then come back in, whereas you're still in the room and you're taking messages. So it's the multitasking aspect of it becomes much bigger, I think.
Definitely, yeah, that cognitive load. And so one of the things we tried to do to mitigate this was really have the moderator, who was one of our technicians, really take ownership of platform orientation, chat moderation, and assertive management of technical issues. I remember the first pilot we did, we hadn't really clarified that, and I was trying to tease out people's technical issues on the hoof, and it just completely clogged up the thing. We spent about 45 minutes figuring out about someone's webcam. So one of the things that helped with this live TV feeling is the technician having a dedicated role, having maybe 20 minutes with the participants in advance of ourselves joining, to really make sure that their webcam and mics are working, that they understand the basics of the platform, and then knowing that the technician will monitor the chat, because that's even difficult to keep an eye on. You know, as a facilitator, I find it, I never look at the chat because I just have too many things to attend to. So there's a sort of acceptance that we came to in realizing that you actually can't attend to everything, and just because there's a chat function there doesn't mean you should use it all the time, because it can just really derail things. Other thing that
can I ask just briefly on that? You know, I think sometimes as educators we are orchestrating, you know, and controlling, pulling a lot of strings, and we're aware of, you know, we're aware of that. We do it to give a good learning experience, but that's a real loss of power. How have you established that relationship with your techs whereby you're happy to say to them, this, I have to give this to you, and this is, yeah.
So say I have another section coming up, Lucy, about technical issues. Say, for example, you were in one of our groups, and in the middle of one of the debriefs, I noticed that your mic was buzzing, or your webcam was flickering on and off. I might just check in with you to see if you've any issues, and then our technician would very assertively pounce on that, direct message you, troubleshoot your issues, and just keep that whole process off the main screen, as it were, and just so that the show can kind of keep going, and so that doesn't derail. And we've really we do keep in contact, like at the breaks, we'll touch base with the technicians to see, you know, hold on, this person's webcam is a bit dodgy, maybe they mightn't be best suited to go into a scenario if we can't fully see them. And so there's a lot of checking in with the technicians about things, and also, you know, it can change during the as the session goes on.
I think really what's become key is at the start of the day, we do a very, Gareth and Kieran do this very thorough introduction to the platform, whichever the platform is, and you kind of preempt. We've got quite a big delay between the start time for participants to log on and the actual start time of our teaching. So then there's quite a lot of time for people to really problem solve any technical issues they're having, so that by the time we start teaching, we either fully know what's going on technically, or that's all been solved and we can just do the teaching part.
And I should add to that it's really beneficial to have about 30 minutes before you actually come on as a facilitator, because that serves as a net to catch people that have really loads of tech issues that could derail and impact on psychological safety. And also latecomers, people are going to arrive late, they're going to open their email on the day of, and that can potentially, you know, impact on psychological safety if someone springs in the middle of it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is tech issues in relation to psychological safety. So one of the big things, like the resounding thing in terms of which platform we ended up settling on, which was Zoom, in case anyone was wondering, was how stable the platform was. I mean, ultimately, if your platform's not stable, you're just not able to do sim. Like, it's the bottom line, and there's lots of different things that can happen. There can be a bit of lag, it can be freezing, crashing. Any of these things really undermine the fluency. And I think, Anita, I've described them as being stressful, really, for the facilitators. Would you agree?
Yeah, my camera dropped the other day while we were doing some teaching, and it was just, I had to turn my camera off and try and carry on speaking. But at that point, I just had no clue if anyone was hearing me or what was happening. So yeah, it was, and really at that point, all you're doing is focusing on your technical issues. It's very difficult to then carry on doing your teaching. So
and there's that feeling of being in the dark, isn't there? Because you don't know where the problem's coming from. Is it your device? Is it your platform? Is it the platform? Is it your network? Or is it anyone else's of the ones I've listed? And also, you mightn't even know who's being affected. So although lots of people, you know, are used to using video conferencing, any of these issues really created discontinuities. They introduced uncertainty, and we felt that this impacted engagement and psychological safety. So to mitigate this, we, in their instruction or joining emails, I should say, we really spent time clearly communicating what the tech requirements were in terms of, you know, microphone, webcam, your Wi-Fi, and how you can optimize all of those things. That's before they ever joined us. And then we, as I said, we did onboarding orientation, and the moderators then had a real systematic approach to troubleshooting issues. As facilitators as well, often we would be logged on 2 devices, so that when one crashed, as it often did, we would be able to flick to a second one as a contingency. And all of this really was in service of maintaining or making, you know, a platform from which we could kind of build psychological safety. We're actually in the process of trying to, in our center at the moment, build a dedicated delivery hub for online sim, where, you know, with some soundproofing and perspex and privacy, really, you know, where there aren't, because we were doing it in offices and libraries, and people used to knock on the door and come in, and the phones used to ring and all sorts of disruption. So we're trying to get around that by having a dedicated sort of professional space. The next section I want to talk about is...
I think we're probably out of time.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, we've got 4 minutes left of the session. Do you have a final thought that you want to share with us?
It's difficult because I haven't actually, that's my own slowness getting through things, but I haven't got onto the section about psychological safety per se. So yeah, I mean, like, just looking at my notes here, I think, you know, a lot of the same themes come up. You know, it's very constrained. It's difficult for individuals to build rapport with one another. There isn't a social space where they can kind of develop a shared, you know, establish common ground and have a shared identity as learners, and all that ties into psychological safety. So we do, as much as we can through icebreakers and breakout rooms, try to let that happen naturally, but it does require a lot of it can feel very one-sided at the time. Another thing is just managing distractions. You know, you're competing with phones, devices, and it's very difficult to know if people are fully engaged because you can't see them with your own eyes. The presence as well, you know, people aren't present in the same way they are in person as a discrete whole. There could be their audio, visual, you can have any combination of the two.
I'd like to finish by thanking Dr. Vaj Kainth, and I confess I don't know if Owen and Anita are doctors or not, but Owen and Anita and Greg, it's been really great having you with us from Maudsley Sim. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in January. Be in touch with us in the meantime if there's anything you need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.